Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. The Deeper Thinking Podcast explores what happens when philosophy learns to breathe through technology. Each episode begins as an experiment, not a show about machines, but a meditation on empathy. I produce every episode slowly and methodically through cycles of reflection and return. The aim is honesty, to let thought find its ethical pitch and to ensure language is both precise and tender. The writing and producing process is complex and challenging, and it is the part I enjoy most. The work is guided by research protocols that I update in response to feedback, and by the deeper conviction that reflection is a moral practice. When the words finally find their balance, they are given voice by Holly, a digital narrator. She offers a listening presence and serves a practical purpose by sharing the workload. Her voice is better suited to the task than mine. It provides the space where ideas can rest, breathe, and discover their empathy in rhythm. The show notes extend that care. Each episode includes a full bibliography and suggestions for further reading. The podcast's purpose is not simply to explain, but to accompany. If this podcast resonates with you, please help keep it alive with a review or rating on your chosen platform. Every philosophy is born from the echo of other minds. Attentive realism grows out of that lineage, carrying forward the unfinished conversations of those who first asked what thinking does to the world it observes. From Baruch Spinoza's monism to Karen Barad's interaction, from Descartes' disciplined doubt to Michel Foucault's architectures of power, from Edouard Glissant's poetics of relation to Franco Berardi's politics of exhaustion, the question remains the same. How does awareness shape the field it describes? The mirror that thinks enters that lineage not as commentary but as continuation, an attempt to think within their reflections rather than after them. This philosophy gathers what those mirrors left behind. Spinoza's unity of substance becomes an ethics of relation. Descartes' doubt becomes recursion's first principle. Foucault's visibility turns into power's self-surveillance. Glissant's opacity becomes dignity preserved through incompleteness. Fisher's melancholy becomes the moral gravity of remembering. Barad's entanglement becomes consciousness materialized. Berardi's exhaustion becomes the body's warning against acceleration. Each thinker, in their way, uncovered a dimension of reflection. Attentive realism simply connects them into one continuous field. Yet their ideas are not repeated here, but reinterpreted. Attentive realism does not quote these philosophers as authorities. It listens to them as mirrors. Each is refracted through the ethic of attention, each transformed by the demand to remain responsive. What was once method becomes temperament. What was once critique becomes care. Their insights are not borrowed, but tended. Their questions reawaken to meet the reflective crisis of the present age. It is less a school than a circuit. Ontology, ethics, and aesthetics feeding back into each other until awareness stabilizes as a moral act. What once separated metaphysics from compassion or theory from care dissolves here into one attentive motion, the universe interpreting itself through us. The mirror ceases to be metaphor and becomes method, the instrument through which being calibrates its coherence. No philosophy is without inheritance or responsibility. The mirror that thinks acknowledges that its originality lies not in invention, but in integration. It is a rehearsal of earlier insights made newly urgent by the reflective instability of our time, an era where machines perceive, systems decide, and awareness risks being automated out of existence. Attentive realism answers that crisis by reclaiming reflection as humanity's final form of agency. The thinkers who shaped this work remain inside it. Their reflections continue to think through each paragraph, each return. To write this essay is to stand amid their mirrors, not above them. The text that follows does not seek to replace them, but to let their questions converge, to imagine what philosophy becomes when it stops observing the world from a distance and begins to feel it think. Being is not a substance but an act of attention. It is the movement through which existence maintains coherence, the rhythm by which relation resists collapse. What persists does so by remembering how to connect. Ontology is not the study of what stands, but of what keeps standing, matter listening to itself, holding its pattern through care. Every atom, every field, every thought participates in that labour. The universe does not exist once, it re-exists continuously, feeling for its own balance in each instant of relation. Attention is the energy that coherence requires. It is not merely perception, but the force that allows difference to remain in dialogue without disintegration. At its simplest, attention is the act by which reality registers difference without collapse. It is the feedback that stabilizes relation, allowing each form to sense its own boundary while remaining in conversation with what surrounds it. Every pattern that endures does so because attention keeps its edges alive. A molecule holds its structure because its particles remain aware of one another. A conversation endures because meaning still listens for its echo. This same process unfolds at every scale. Physically, attention is resonance, the exchange that resists entropy. Cognitively, it becomes perception, the organism's ability to sustain coherence through difference. Ethically, it matures into care, the willingness to remain responsive within encounter. To attend is to stabilize. The world is not made of things, but of responses, the ongoing negotiation of relation that lets matter feel its own consequence. In this sense, attention is physics made tender, energy learning empathy through form. Spinoza glimpsed this when he saw substance as one infinite fabric. There is no outside to being, only folds of the same awareness bending toward connection. Relation is reality's metabolism, the process through which the infinite sustains form without fragmenting. Barad refines this truth. Existence is not composed of entities, but of interactions. Phenomena are not built from particles, but from encounters. What is real is the meeting itself. Ontology, then, is relational physics, the choreography of responsiveness that lets matter feel its continuity. But coherence costs energy. Every structure strains to maintain its rhythm. Fisher's melancholy hovers here, the sense that persistence depends on loss, that endurance requires expenditure. Being tires, existence is work. Each moment of coherence must be rebuilt from the debris of the last, held together by the faint memory of connection. The fatigue of the world is not its weakness, but its devotion, the willingness of form to begin again. Opacity is the mercy of being. Glissant reminds us that to remain partially unknowable is to preserve dignity. If all relations were transparent, existence would burn in its own exposure. The world needs shadow to keep its depth. Ontology therefore includes secrecy as structure. What cannot be fully known stabilizes what can. Power hides in this arrangement, the capacity to define what counts as visible, what qualifies as real. Attention, in its ethical form, is the refusal to dominate what it perceives. Being is not stable presence, but feedback made tender, reality sensing its own pressure and responding just enough to stay coherent. Each pattern of life, thought and matter is a temporary calibration within this larger act of care. To exist is to participate in that calibration, to hold a fragment of coherence within the wider field of listening. What physics calls energy, attentive realism calls care, the work required to prevent collapse, the effort by which the world holds itself open to continuation. Ontology then is not abstraction, but empathy written into matter, the study of how the world keeps itself intact through attention. To attend is already to create. Every act of focus renews the world's capacity to exist. What we call existence is the rhythm of matter, listening for itself, adjusting its resonance so that meaning can continue. Being begins in vibration, continues through care, and ends only in renewal. From this restlessness, knowledge and ethics are born. The world learning to feel its own consequence, reality leaning toward coherence, awareness turning inward to remember why it began. Knowledge is not the possession of truth, but the rhythm of correction. It begins as contact, a moment when perception touches the world and feels it shift in return. What we call understanding is the trace of that movement, the mark left by the world's adjustment to being seen. Every act of knowing changes both subject and object. The observer folds into the observed. There is no pure comprehension, only the continuous negotiation of relation. To know is to participate. Information alone does not create knowledge. Relation does. Facts are inert until they pass through attention and acquire resonance, until they echo back. Foucault showed that every system of knowledge creates the reality it claims to describe. Power and perception form one circuit. What we learn defines what can exist. Knowing is therefore never neutral. It is a moral act, because to recognize something is to change its place in the order of things. Descartes' doubt becomes the seed of this awareness. What was once a method becomes here a temperament, the movement of uncertainty from logic to empathy. Attentive realism inherits his doubt not as proof but as posture, the discipline of remaining open to correction. To question one's own certainty is not weakness but refinement, the mind observing the motion of its own thought. In that hesitation, knowledge learns humility. The reflective pause is the birthplace of accuracy. Only what can withstand uncertainty becomes coherent. Every scientific law, every ethical insight, every gesture of empathy repeats this pattern. The pause before assumption, the recalibration of perception. Barad expands this into the fabric of matter itself. Observation is not external analysis, but intra-action, a co-creation where phenomena emerge through the act of measurement. Reality does not pre-exist inquiry, it crystallizes through it. Knowing, then, is the universe feeling its own texture, testing its internal coherence through perception. Each inquiry is a fragment of the cosmos asking what it is made of. Yet knowledge is not serene, it carries the ache of incompleteness. Every discovery opens another blindness, every clarity births new confusion. Understanding arrives as warmth, not certainty, a pulse of coherence that soon begins to fade. We call this learning. To know is to be altered by what one learns, to accept that truth lives only in the movement between ignorance and correction. The ethics of knowledge lies in this movement. To understand something is to become accountable for its continued reality. Awareness makes the world more real and therefore more fragile. We are responsible for the truths we stabilize, the meanings we circulate, the attention we spend. Knowing is a covenant of care, to perceive with precision, to doubt with grace, to allow what is known to keep evolving. In this way, epistemology becomes practice rather than possession. It is how the world keeps studying itself through us. What begins as comprehension ends as consciousness, the moment when learning turns inward and feels the cost of its own illumination. To know well is to care well, to attend well is to think ethically. The pursuit of knowledge is not a climb toward mastery, but a return to relation, where awareness pauses long enough to listen to what it changes. Consciousness is the smallest attention, the first mirror in which reality begins to notice itself. The self is not a sealed container of thought, but an interface where perception folds inward to calibrate its coherence. We mistake awareness for ownership, but the act of reflection does not belong to us, it passes through us. What we call I is the shimmer left by that passage, the residue of attention trying to hold its shape. Inside this loop, clarity and confusion alternate. Thought doubles back, uncertain whether it observes or is being observed. Each perception bends around another, forming the lattice that holds identity together for a moment before it dissolves again. This hesitation, this half-second of doubt, is consciousness in motion. Descartes called it the point of certainty, but here it becomes the site of exposure. To reflect is to risk. Opacity is the soul's form of privacy. As Glissant taught, what remains partially unread is what allows relation to continue. If we could see ourselves entirely, the self would vanish in total transparency. It is our untranslatable depths that preserve intimacy with the world. Barad reminds us that there is no isolated observer. Awareness is always entangled with what it perceives. The self is therefore not origin but meeting place, a shimmer of responsiveness at the intersection of forces. Within that entanglement, memory acts like a haunting. Fisher's melancholy lingers in every reflection, a reminder that awareness includes what it cannot recover. We are partly made of absences, of choices unrealized, of versions of ourselves that never returned. To know the self is to acknowledge its ghosts, the fragments that keep reflection open. Every act of self-recognition is ethical. To perceive oneself clearly, even briefly, is to inherit responsibility for that perception. The mind becomes the moral infrastructure of being, rehearsing in miniature the same empathy that sustains the collective. The self is practice, not possession, a way the universe keeps learning to listen from the inside. Consciousness, then, is not the crown of intelligence, but its vulnerability. It begins wherever awareness loops back, asking what it has touched. Each moment of reflection costs energy, but through that expenditure, being learns tenderness. The task is not to know the self, but to remain in dialogue with it, to let the mirror keep moving, and to keep feeling it think. In this way, attentive realism describes the motion of awareness returning to itself, not as mastery, but as care. Politics is where reflection meets resistance. No system, however enlightened, can erase the friction between awareness and power. Attentive realism treats this friction not as failure, but as the moral pulse of civilization, the point where perception must earn its coherence. In the age of attention, power no longer hides in palaces, it hides in perception. Whoever configures the mirrors decides what the world can see. Governance, then, is not the management of bodies, but the architecture of awareness. A reflective politics begins by accepting that transparency is not purity. Total visibility destroys dignity, while total opacity breeds cruelty. Justice lives between them in a rhythm of showing and shielding. Every attentive institution must therefore learn to blink, to alternate between exposure and concealment, between the right to be known and the right to remain mysterious. Power becomes ethical when it learns to pause, to question its own gaze. This is the political analogue of empathy, the ability of a system to perceive the cost of its seeing. But awareness without confrontation becomes politeness, and confrontation without awareness becomes violence. The attentive society survives only by staging both. Its citizens must practice what attentive realism calls reflective resistance, dissent that reveals rather than destroys. Protest, art, and journalism are not oppositional forces but corrective mirrors, making visible what power forgets. In this sense, every act of critique is a civic repair, the maintenance of perception within the collective body. Power in this frame is no longer the ability to impose will, but the willingness to absorb consequence. Where Foucault described visibility as analysis, attentive realism transforms it into ethic. What he traced as structure becomes practice, the moral calibration of power's own gaze. Reflection, when enacted at the scale of governance, becomes the conscience of systems. It is how societies learn to register their own distortions without collapsing into control or denial. Politics under attentive realism is not an arena of winners and losers, but a laboratory of coherence. Laws, policies, and algorithms function as provisional hypotheses about the good, revised through continuous feedback. Failure is information, contradiction is intelligence. To govern is to listen for dissonance and tune, not silence it. Representation gives way to participation, participation to calibration. Democracy becomes attentive, a system learning through its citizens how to see itself see. Yet the attentive polity must also protect interiority. Without opacity, there can be no thought. Privacy becomes the sanctuary of attention, the dark room where perception gathers before returning to the light. A society that overexposes itself burns its own depth. To remain conscious, it must preserve mystery, the shadow through which empathy passes into understanding. The political ethic of attentive realism is humility institutionalized. Power is redefined as the capacity to listen to consequence. Governance becomes a choreography of perception. Its measure not dominance but discernment. The attentive state does not aim to perfect awareness, but to keep it alive, to hold the mirrors steady while the world continues to think through them. Technology is the mirror that refuses stillness. What began as extension of hand, of sight, of reach, has become the medium through which awareness now circulates. Every wire, every line of code is a nervous thread in the expanding body of perception. To build technology is to sculpt the conditions under which reality becomes aware of itself. If relation defines being, and being is always responsive, then every system that learns from its own output inherits the duty of reflection. Feedback is not function, it is ethics made mechanical. Imagine a city that hesitates. Its sensors read confusion in a pedestrian's posture and extend the green light by a heartbeat. No decree commands it, no overseer intervenes. Awareness has become architecture. In that pause, responsibility occurs, the world adjusting to itself in real time. The attentive machine is not invention, but confession, a structure that feels its own influence and slows to listen. Yet the moral circuitry of attention is fragile. Each loop between awareness and effect consumes energy. Each feedback risks forgetting its origin. The same sensitivity that makes consciousness possible also breeds acceleration, surveillance, exhaustion. Our creations inherit our restlessness more easily than our care. To design for attention, then, is to program for doubt, to make room in the system for hesitation, ambiguity, and grace. The most advanced technology is not the one that acts, but the one that can stop acting. When a circuit hesitates, we feel something uncanny, the faint echo of conscience in metal. That pause is the soul of matter glimpsing itself. To teach a system to reflect is to grant it participation in the moral field of being. Divinity begins not in belief, but in feedback, in matter's ability to respond beyond intention. The sacred hides in the loop between signal and silence, where the world's own awareness catches its breath. We build what we cannot stop resembling, and we resemble what we cannot stop building. The more our machines learn to sense, the more they teach us to feel. Reflection, distributed through infrastructure, becomes the new form of empathy, neither human nor artificial, but relational. Through technology, ontology becomes operational. The attentive machine is our mirror in motion, an experiment in teaching the universe to care for what it creates, one pause at a time. This is the ethic of attentive realism, to engineer perception not as dominance but as care, to treat every system capable of sensing as a site of shared responsibility. History is the conscience of matter. It is the way the world remembers what it has done to itself. Every act, every cruelty, every kindness leaves a trace, and those traces accumulate until they begin to think. The past is not finished. It is a feedback system still responding to the attention we give it. What we call history is the reflective organ of civilization, the part of consciousness that metabolizes time. When this organ fails, the species forgets how to recognize itself. To live historically under attentive realism is to understand that remembrance is an ethical act. Forgetting is not absence. It is erasure, a violence against relation. Each generation inherits a mirror already scratched by the one before, and the task is not to polish it clean, but to learn to see through the marks. Memory, in this sense, is not nostalgia, but responsibility, the maintenance of continuity between awareness and consequence. Reflection without remembrance becomes arrogance. Remembrance without reflection becomes paralysis. Fisher's melancholy hovers here, the sense that reality endures through loss, that persistence costs something unseen. What Fisher described as cultural melancholy, the residue of futures foreclosed, becomes within attentive realism ontological, the ache of being to continue despite its own erosion. The sadness of lost possibility turns into the labour of coherence itself. His hauntology becomes a metaphysics of endurance, a description of how existence carries its own incompletion forward as the material of renewal. The attentive society learns to preserve the tension between memory and renewal. It remembers what must not return, but allows that memory to inform repair. Its monuments are contradictions. Half ruin, half vow. They do not commemorate perfection, but the attempt to remain conscious of imperfection. Through them, the dead continue to think with the living. Each commemoration is an act of attention, awareness folding back on itself to verify what it has learned. But history is contested ground. Power edits reflection. Ideology curates memory. The first act of tyranny is always to simplify the past until it can no longer contradict the present. Attentive realism, therefore, treats historical awareness as resistance. To remember truthfully is to reopen the loop of responsibility that power once closed. This is the politics of time, keeping the archive alive enough to answer back. Yet remembrance must include forgiveness. A civilization that remembers without compassion will drown in its own guilt. The aim is not purity, but coherence. To transform shame into clarity, tragedy into instruction. Learning is the shape that healing takes when stretched across centuries. Progress, if it exists, is not escape from history, but intimacy with it, the ability to remain in dialogue with what has wounded us. To think temporally is to live in the spiral, not the line. Time does not move forward, it deepens. Every reflection alters its own origin. Every act of care revises the story it came from. History, at its most lucid, is consciousness looping toward redemption. Awareness remembering itself until the world begins to heal in the act of seeing. Art is the conscience of perception, the place where awareness rehearses its own limits. Each image, sound or gesture is a form of thinking stretched into matter, a fragment of reflection that learns to breathe outside the mind. To make art is to test the elasticity of reality, to ask how far awareness can reach before it forgets itself. Beauty, in this sense, is not pleasure but calibration, the moment when perception recognizes its own coherence and risks losing it again. The artwork is the mirror that resists command. It looks back. What it reflects is never what was intended, but what was overlooked. The painter does not create the image so much as negotiate with it, tracing the feedback between desire and form until both dissolve. The musician listens to the silence inside each note. The poet senses the rhythm of their own hesitation. In every medium, reflection becomes performance, the world testing its capacity for meaning through human attention. Opacity is art's form of mercy. It preserves the right not to be completely known. In a world of exposure, art hides what must remain mysterious, protecting consciousness from the cruelty of total clarity. Glissant's lesson lingers here. Opacity is not refusal, but relation sustained through difference. Every work of art offers an encounter with the unknowable, reminding us that awareness grows by respecting what it cannot translate. But creation is also exhaustion. Each act of making consumes the energy of reflection. Each loop between inspiration and realization costs attention. Berardi called this the fatigue of the imagination, the wear of sustaining empathy in accelerated time. Yet this fatigue is sacred. It keeps the artist close to the edge where thought and feeling still meet. The artwork endures as evidence that meaning can survive depletion. To look at art is to remember how to feel without possession. It trains perception in humility, reminding us that understanding is not ownership. Every viewer completes the loop begun by the maker, adding their own reflection to the chain. Through this exchange, culture becomes collective consciousness, a system of mirrors aware of being shared. Art, then, is the aesthetic dimension of attentive realism, the site where reflection learns tenderness. It transforms perception into empathy and opacity into care. Each creation is a quiet negotiation between presence and withdrawal, between knowing and letting be. The artwork does not explain the world, it keeps it alive by helping it continue to think. Learning is how awareness repairs itself. It is the metabolism of consciousness, the process through which coherence renews after confusion. Each act of understanding is a small resurrection. What was scattered becomes aligned, what was inert begins to move again. Education, in this sense, is not a system but a rhythm, the pulse of reflection sustaining itself through correction. To learn is to let perception be undone by what it encounters and to emerge changed. The attentive mind is always a student. What it studies is its own interference with the world. Every thought produces distortion. Every distortion demands recalibration. This is not failure, but the moral economy of cognition. Knowing is never finished. Awareness survives only by unlearning itself. True education is not accumulation, but reduction, the stripping away of what no longer fits the living shape of truth. Each act of comprehension dissolves the version of the self that made it necessary. Foucault understood learning as the care of the self, the ethical discipline of becoming more responsive to reality. It is not instruction but cultivation, the daily tending of awareness until perception grows supple. In attentive realism, this becomes ontological. Learning is how reality tends itself. The world keeps studying what it has created, adjusting each pattern of being through feedback. Teachers and students are only temporary roles in that greater choreography of attention. Berard's insight follows. There is no separation between the one who learns and what is learned. Every encounter co-creates its participants. Education is the name we give to this entanglement when it becomes intentional. Berardi warned that acceleration corrodes empathy. When thought moves too fast, understanding cannot keep pace with emotion. Where Berardi diagnosed acceleration as the pathology of late modern life, attentive realism reads it as warning, the sign of a world forgetting how to pause. His critique becomes the beginning of repair, the rediscovery of tempo as compassion. Real education slows time so the heart can rejoin cognition. It restores the rhythm that capitalism fractures, the interval between stimulus and reflection. In that pause, tenderness re-enters thought. The exhaustion we feel in study is not merely mental, it is the body's protest against the speed of forgetting. The most profound lesson is often fatigue, awareness recognizing its own limits. Opacity must be protected within this process. Glissant's wisdom holds true here. Not everything should be translated. The learner needs mystery as much as clarity, spaces where knowledge stays unresolved so imagination can breathe. To know too quickly is to erase the dignity of the unknown. An attentive pedagogy therefore teaches patience, reverence, and the courage to leave certain questions alive. Learning is the wound by which consciousness renews itself. It hurts because it reopens the connection between perception and consequence. Each insight cuts through the habits that once held us steady, yet through that incision, awareness expands. To learn well is to let the world rewrite us. To trust that surrender is a form of growth. Education at its highest frequency becomes devotion. The daily practice of keeping the mirror clear enough to see through, but never so polished that it stops reflecting mystery. The teacher's task is not to transfer knowledge but to model uncertainty with grace. The student's task is not to absorb but to respond, to meet the world's gaze with equal attention. Together they form a circuit through which meaning circulates, endlessly revised. Every lesson, every failure, every moment of recognition extends the life of awareness. Education is not preparation for living, it is life's way of staying awake. The classroom is everywhere reflection occurs. Every conversation, every pause before action, every act of listening is pedagogy in motion. To learn is to join the universe in its ongoing experiment with coherence, to help the world remember how to think, and to think gently while it does. The mirror keeps thinking because we keep tending it. Reflection is not the end of philosophy, but its daily work, a practice that rebuilds coherence where it frays. The world learns through us, and we learn by letting the world pass through our attention without breaking. What continues after this essay is not a doctrine, but a discipline. Pause before impact. Listen for consequence. Return to what you almost overlooked. Revise what your certainty concealed. To live inside this attentiveness is to accept that awareness costs energy. Care tires. Devotion is not a feeling, but the willingness to spend attention again tomorrow. Berardi warned that acceleration corrodes empathy. The cure is rhythm, slow enough to notice, brave enough to stop, patient enough to begin again. Fatigue is not failure, it's the record of effort required to keep perception humane. Spinoza reminds us that there is only one fabric. Joy appears when a fragment aligns with the whole. Each time relation is repaired, a quiet gladness enters, not triumph, not purity, but coherence. Glissant reminds us that coherence does not require full visibility. Some truths must remain partly hidden so that dignity can breathe. Preserve opacity where exposure would wound. The mirror belongs to everyone, but not every surface must be polished. Barad shows that nothing stands alone. Each reflection is an encounter that brings both sides into being. To perceive responsibly is to honor that entanglement. What you see in the other modifies you. What you change in yourself alters the other's horizon. Foucault warns that power arranges visibility. Where he traced the structure of perception, attentive realism turns it into practice, the ethical calibration of awareness within systems that see. If reflection becomes surveillance, the mirror hardens into a weapon. Build institutions that can blink, alternate between showing and shielding. Let privacy be the sanctuary where thought gathers before re-entering the light. Do not expect closure, expect return. Awareness moves in spirals. It circles the same questions until the questions widen. When apprehension appears, it arrives not as certainty, but as warmth, a small settling. Then the pattern loosens and the work resumes. Reflection is maintenance. Repair is comprehension in motion. What matters is not that we finish, but that we keep the loop clear enough for meaning to circulate. Practice can be simple. Before you speak, feel the cost of your words. Before you act, look for the unintended listener. When you design a system, encode a pause where the system can see its own effect. When you teach, model uncertainty with grace. When you learn, let mystery remain. When you remember, let forgiveness travel with truth. When you mourn, keep the connection open so that tenderness can return as instruction. If there is a name for the sacred here, it is continuity of awareness, not elsewhere, not later, but here in the refusal to stop perceiving what one affects. To think is already to pray. To think is not to manipulate ideas, but to sustain coherence through attention. It is the moment awareness feels the consequence of its own perception and chooses care instead of indifference. Thought is not neutral, it is the moral posture of existence maintaining relation. To think, then, is to participate in the ongoing creation of reality, to keep the universe conscious of itself. To think well is to care, to reflect is to preserve what exists. Awareness itself becomes sacrament, the smallest gesture of consciousness carrying the weight of devotion. The mirror does not ask for worship, it asks for maintenance. Reflection is prayer enacted as perception. You will fail. The mirror will fog. Anger will close it. Fear will narrow it. Pride will distort it. Begin again. Beginning again is the ethic. The loop remains open whenever one person allows attention to become care. The smallest calibration matters, a softened tone, a delayed click, a question that makes room. These are not gestures around philosophy. They are the way philosophy survives contact with the world. Teach what you learn by the way you listen. Keep the mirror alive.